Today is May 17th, 2008. I am Eric Mishnick, and it is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Eureka, South Dakota. Could you please state your full name?
William Adam Merkel.
All right. And when and where were you born?
Oh, about 10 miles northeast of Eureka in McPherson County.
And what year was that?
1925.
Have you ever heard an interesting story about your birth?
Not that I can. I was born out on the farm.
Okay.
And so were all my other brothers and sisters.
Okay. Was a midwife or a doctor present at your birth?
Yeah, they tried to go get the doctor whenever they had a birth,
Okay.
if possible.
Could you share some of your earliest memories with us?
I'll have to tell you one. Being there were 8 living in that house, and I and my brother slept in the middle room back there, and we slept in a single bed. My brother on one end of the bed, and I was on the other end of the bed, so our feet would cross each other this way, and we slept that way. Brother Milton.
Let's turn to your family a little bit. Could you tell me about your grandparents on your mother's side?
My mother's side, they came in from South Russia in 1888. They started farming northeast of town here. This was barren country. There was what today we call Spring Creek. Mom used to tell me that they used to share that the grass was so tall they hardly couldn't see the cows there. So they kind of had to watch them. When my mother grew up, she had to herd a lot of the cattle during the summer months. There were no fences, and she had to be out there, rain or shine, and she'd take care of the cows and graze them, which was hard work for her. And then sometimes she had to go to the neighbors about 3 miles away to some relatives to pick up some things. And back home again, they couldn't stay around to visit very long, my mother said. They had to go get the parts or communication and come right back home again. My grandpa, when the first year they were homesteading there, they hardly had no crop, and I guess he went to Jamestown, North Dakota then to earn a little money for the family to keep him survive through those years. And then how they made the sod, they hauled in the clay, and they had the little straw that they put in with them, I guess when they, how they harvested, I don't know. But they mixed that in with the clay, and then they made blocks out of them, then they dried them, and then they built their house with that.
And what were your grandparents' names?
William Wilhelm Joachim. My grandma was a Isler, and from my dad's side was Adam Merkel, and his first wife was an Aldinger, and the second wife was a Curly. His first wife had an accident, fell off the back end of the wagon and broke her neck, and she died. The grave site is still on the prairie out there. He buried her right out there in the country. It's about 8 miles north of town. And then after that, he sent a letter over to Russia to have a second lady come in, who he married then, a Curly lady, Curly, and married her. And out of that, from the first wife, he had 3 children. From the second wife, he had 6 children.
Was it a common practice to send for wives from Russia?
I can't tell you that.
Okay. What type of person was your grandmother on your mom's side?
Pardon?
What type of person?
Oh, she was short. She was a good disciplinarian. Should I say, 1934, when it was so dry, they let the hogs out into the yard so they could scrounge for themselves. And I was told, don't you dare let those hogs get into the potato patch. Well, of course, as a youngster, maybe about 8 years old, he had other things in mind. And pretty soon the hogs were in the potato patch and Mom caught him in there. And she took me back into the house and she applied the Board of Education on the seat of learning. and But she was a good mother. She was a very tender-hearted mother. She had a good ability of managing things. And they worked hard, those ladies in those days. That's all I can say.
Okay. What type of person was your grandfather on your father's side?
He was tall. He had lost an eye when he was still in Russia. And so he lived through the whole lifespan over here with one eye. He was an auctioneer by trade and a farmer. And he was tall. My grandfather Merkel was tall. Okay. But they had, let me explain that. They had 3 children from the first wife and 6 children from the second wife, like I said.
Okay. What type of person was your grandfather from your mother's side?
He was short, stubby, very aggressive. He traveled around the country. He was in South Texas. He was in Beulah, North Dakota. Later on, in later years, we found out that he even had some property up in Beulah, North Dakota. And he was quite a worker. He aggressive in his farming years. And after he had homesteaded, then a lot of the other fellows that came in and homesteaded, they gave up homesteading, and Dad bought their property. Grandpa bought their property then and added onto his property. He was a good farmer.
Did any of your grandparents ever share any stories about Russia with you?
No, not to my knowledge.
Okay. Where did your grandparents live when you were growing up?
Well, they both lived, and one of them, Grandpa Merkel lived in Greenway, and Grandpa Yoakum lived in Eureka here, as I remember them. Of course, Grandpa Yoakum, he was blind, but even though he had a little well in his yard here, and he would carry water to the fruit trees there and try and water them. And Grandpa Merkel lived in Greenway, which was a small town. And we'd go up there and visit every so often. I remember my grandpa just a little bit. And I also remember my grandma Merkel. She was diabetic, so she was very hard of hearing. And in those years, for a hearing aid, they had a tube that they inserted into their ear and was about this long, and it had a kind of a cone shape on it. And then when you wanted to communicate them, you talked into that cone so she could hear it. She was a bad diabetic, and a lot of her sons were diabetic too. The youngest one died when he was 38 years of age due to being bad diabetic.
Were your grandparents religious?
My grandpa, oh yeah, Grandpa Yoakum was very, very religious man. He trusted the Lord for many things, and the Lord was good to him. He actually started the country church that we had out there. First of all, they had church in their home, in the Yoakum home, and then they bought a building at Venturia, and they moved it down to about 2 miles south of his farm, and that's where I and my parents attended church for many years, till 1955. I never heard my Grandpa Yoakum preach, but from what I hear, when he got to with some of the pastors, he would really share about the Bible and was very knowledgeable of the Bible. And my dad did a lot of Sunday morning services. He conducted, the minister never came every Sunday, so my dad did a lot of that every Sunday. And Saturday nights he would usually sit around in the light and study his sermon, and on Sunday morning he'd conduct the Sunday morning service in a little country church.
Okay. Could you tell me about any of your aunts and uncles?
My aunts and uncles, let me think a little bit. Actually, one of the uncles, like Uncle Fred, he continued the business of auctioneering like Grandpa Merkel did. And of course, my other uncle on the Merkel side, he became State Utilities Commissioner. He was South Dakota State Utilities Commissioner for 30 years, which was quite an honor for doing it for that many years. And from my mother's side, Yoakum side, her brother Dan started the museum in Dickinson, North Dakota, and deprived me out of his inheritance. And so, but if you ever drive to Dickinson and you see the Yoakum Memorial Museum, that was my mom's brother started that. And from there on out, they started getting bigger. And some of my other brothers, and Adam Yoakum, the one that wrote a lot of the history of the early years, which is on record now that you can obtain and read. Very interesting. He had a little notebook in his pocket, what took place years ago. And then after he retired from teaching schools for many years, then he wrote history of the early years, and it'll be on record where you can find it.
Okay. Where did they live when you were growing up?
My mother and dad, or are you talking about?
Your aunts and uncles, did they live close to you when you were growing up?
Yeah, they were about 5 miles away, and on the other side, from the Yoakum side, they lived kind of in a small area there. They were all within a few miles of us.
Okay. Did they visit often, or did you visit them often?
Well, not too much there. Not that I can recall too many times. Sunday afternoon sometimes, then sometimes the evenings. Not too much.
Okay. Did you have a favorite aunt or uncle?
Not really. I liked them all.
Okay. Could you tell me a little something about your cousins?
Not too much. I don't think I share anything right offhand.
Okay. Could you tell us about your father?
My dad? How I wish we'd asked more about how he met my mother. That I don't know why we fell down on the job at that time, how they were married, but that's the story. That when they got married, Dad was about 22, 23 years of age, and Mom was 19, newly married. Then they took their horses and wagons and plows and a hog, and they loaded it into 2 train cars in Greenway. And then they went down to Murdo, South Dakota. There they had to unload. And then they hooked the hay rack and the wagons together again and lead the cow about 25 miles south to about 7 miles west of White River. That's where they homesteaded. Dad went down the year before and put up an 8x8 shack on dirt floor. And then when they moved down there in the spring of the year, Dad didn't. They had 4 horses, so in order to make ends meet, Dad took those 4 horses and started freighting truck out of Valentine, Nebraska, so they would have something to live on. But of course, Mom had to live alone, and she lived by the prairie dogs, which is a lot of rattlesnake country. They said that when they walked, they had to watch out just every step they took so they wouldn't get involved with a rattlesnake. And my dad often shares that when the rattlesnakes, when they would be plowing up, they plowed out a plot of ground there. When the rattlesnakes would see the horses coming, they would get away. But as soon as they saw the humans, they would wrap up. They were never got hit by a rattlesnake, but they were really had to be very careful. So they stayed down there about a year and a half. Mom said the first winter when they were down there, the cattle, they were kind of free-for-all cattle. They were so skinny by spring they hardly couldn't move. The peak point that if you ever go to White River, go 7 miles west, there's a place they call the Twin Buttes. And I talked to some of the people once in a while from down there, and yeah, we remember that place real well. And my mother said they just lived a little bit away from the Twin Buttes. Then when they were down there for about a year and a half, I guess Grandpa Yoakum came down and looked the situation over, and about a year and a half later they came back. And then they took the 4 horses, they put them on a wagon, and they drove all the way from White River to north of town here. But and they slept under the wagon, and I don't know how they got the food together. I don't know that. We should have inquired about that. But the interesting thing about it, what my mother used to say, as soon as those horses got a chance to leave the place, they would always head northeast. And as soon as they were down there a year and a half, and when they came closer to the farm up here where they came from, the horses started winnowing, but they knew they were back home again.
Very nice. When and where was your father born?
North, about 8 miles north of town here, at the Merkel, at the Adam Merkel farm there. Must have been in 1890, something like that, yeah.
How did your father express his emotions, such as fear, love, or anger?
Oh, not, not very much. He didn't have too much anger, but sometimes we fellas got a scolding a little bit.
Could you describe your relationship with your father?
Very good. Had a very good relationship with my father and my mother. Mother was a tender-hearted lady.
How did your father cope during the hard times?
During the 34 drought,
Yeah.
oh boy, that was something else. They never got themselves government commodities. They roughed it through themselves. They never wanted any government handout. And as I recall it, and I could actually show you the field where it happened, the corn was only about a foot high. And so what they did, they just pushed a stake down, and I still helped pull those corn stalks out and stack them around that little peg. And I just talked to my brother not too long ago, and I told him about that. I remember that. Yeah, and he says the cattle wouldn't even want to eat that stuff during the winter months, that corn that we pulled out of the ground to feed the cattle. Yeah, those were tough years. They had just built the house in 33, which is out there now, and in 34 they had the drought. My mother tells me in 1934 there was nothing out in the pasture, nothing. And I think they even drove some cattle to Greenway, and the government bought them, and they killed them because there was no feed for the cattle, and the government paid them about $2 or $3 a head for those animals, and they threw them in a ditch and covered them up again. But those people had no choice but to get rid of them. The horses they tried to keep as much as possible. The thing that I remember a lot about is cleaning the barn, the old horse barn, the cows. Horses were in the barn, cows were in the barn. Every winter, as soon as it got a little bit cold, they were put in the barn. That was still the old barn. We have a newer barn out there now. But then during the winter months, every 3 days we had to haul hay there was a haystack was put up on the north side of the farm, and we had to haul it on the wagon, a hay wagon, and Dad had made, that was before my days, Dad made a big door on the west side of that barn, old barn. Then we could only roll up 2 or 3 loads at a time. And the one time I remember, I always unhitched the horses and went to the other side. The hay sling was 4 ropes with cross ropes on them, and 2 ropes that came out of the barn and hooked on the other end of the hay sling. And then the steel cable came across the top and hooked it on the front end of the hay rack when they rolled the hay up. And I usually unhooked the horses and took them on the other side, and those horses already knew that they were going to pull. And one time I took off with them, and I looked around, and here the dog was going about 15 feet in the air. He was standing across the table, and it quickly tightened up and just threw the dog up in the air. I still remember that very vividly. And then we take them off and pull the rope cable all back again, put the sling in again, and fill it up again, but every 3 days during winter months. One time I remember my 2 older brothers were in service then already. It just was too cold to haul hay into the hay mow. So we just got 1 load, and we took it on the other side of the barn. There was just a small door. Dad forked it in, and I had to fork it away for a few days again. And then I'll have to share this one with you too. And then, of course, you put the hay down, and there was all the excess there. So the horses and the cows, the manure was all hauled away right a little ways away from the barn there. It was piled up real nice, about this thick, and they stomped it down with the horses, and later on Dad had kind of a roller, and then they would, when it got drier during the summer months, it was about a layer about manure about this thick, and they'd make square blocks. You would pull a string, and they'd punch a line in there and a line here. You push them out, make the square blocks, you lay them up one against the other. Then about a week or so later, they would take 2 blocks and lay one across the top. And then after that, they were laying them up another way. I don't remember how that was made. And then by the time they were done at the fall of the year, they were piled up like this. And then we hauled them into a shed to be used in the winter months for fuel. And that was the thing about it, because when you used all this fuel, there was nothing but ashes. I remember Dad taking the ashes out every night in a big tub. We had to carry them out every night. Then about a year or two, maybe about a year, and then he went to lignite coal, used lignite coal in the furnace in that newer house that I'm talking about now. And then pretty soon he quit lignite coal too and used the regular Roundup Montana coal, which were a lot better burning coal. That was a good furnace in that house too. I'll have to show you that new home. Excuse me.
When, where, and how did your father die?
Well, he had prostate problem for quite a few years, and but he kept working until we had our auction sale on Tuesday, and then that night we took him away to the hospital, and he passed away on Monday morning. And the interesting thing about it was that my mom was down the hallway on Monday morning, and then he called for her. And then my mother was kind of short, so she had to step on a little stool, and she leaned over the bed, and he gave her a hug, and he laid back his arms, and he passed away.
Speaking of your mother, could you tell us a little bit about your mother?
Oh, my mother got to be 98 years of age, and she lived in her own home till she was 95 years of age, and she lived here in town by herself after I got married, and then she moved to town, and she went along real good. She never used a cane because she said a cane is for old people, not for her. That's about it. She did real well.
When and where was she born?
My mother?
Yeah.
She was born here 10 miles north of town. Grandpa Yoakum came in 1888, and she was born in 1894. Yeah.
Okay. How did she express emotions such as fear, love, or anger?
Never showed it too much.
Could you describe your relationship with your mother?
Very good. Had a good relationship with my mom. After Dad passed away, I lived with my mother for about 15 years before I got married.
And what was her profession?
Mom? She was strictly a housewife. She never worked outside the home. Yeah, they worked hard. Some of those women, they worked hard, especially when it came to the annual, when they butchered the beef or the hog. Those ladies had to work hard. My mother worked hard in those days.
How did she cope during the hard times?
They struggled their way through. They made a living. And then, of course, I'll have to share this with you. They had built this house in 1933. And then in 1934 is when it was the dust storm bowl days. And as a youngster, I remember them painting the house the following year. And then around 3 or 4 o'clock, I can still remember that dark cloud coming in from the northwest. And it was within a few minutes, that whole thing was paint was just black. And the thing I remember about them, they were going to get kerosene and wash the whole thing down again to get all that black out of that wet paint. I remember that cloud of dust very vividly.
Did you take any measures to try to keep dust from getting into the home?
Not really, no. Well, that was a new home at that time. Yeah.
How many children did your parents have?
There were 9 of us in the family. And 2 of them are deceased by now. The oldest brother is still living. The second oldest sister is still living. The third brother passed away. The fourth brother still living. And then I have a sister in California. She's still living. And then and then his younger brother lives in Washburn, and Andy, who lived in Leola, he passed away already. And my younger sister lives here in Eureka.
Okay. Who was the more strict parent?
The what? I didn't.
Who was the more strict parent, your father or your mother?
My dad. They were fairly equal. When they had disciplinary problems, they kind of talked it over with themselves. But Dad was in those years, Father was the ruling party.
What were some of the types of punishment you received?
Oh, the spanking on the back end. Yeah, had a strap hanging on the wall in the old house. Yeah.
Do you remember any stories besides the hog story that you got disciplined for?
Not really.
Okay.
No.
Who influenced your life more?
Mom and Dad did. They both shared in that one. Yeah. They were good to me.
Okay. What types of things did your parents do on their free time?
Dad did a lot of reading, even though they only had about a 3rd or 4th grade education. Dad did a lot of reading. He would sit, and in the evening, he would go into his room, and especially in I remember the newer home more so, that he would be in his living room there and do a lot of reading then. And my mom only had a 4th grade education, but during the war years, she wrote to us fellas in a letter, as quite often. 2 of my brothers were in the service at the first World War II, and I came in in World War II, but with the last group. So I was still a World War II vet.
Okay.
But my brothers were in about almost 4 years. Some of them over 4 years. 1 or 2, right close to 4 years.
Okay. What types of things did your father read?
What kind of magazines?
What type of books or magazines?
Oh, he had mostly religious news magazines that he shared his interest. His interest was in religion. Anything that had anything to do about the Lord, he would read that, and sometimes other things too. Farm papers. That was his line. Dad was mechanically inclined, and actually passed a lot of that on to the boys in the family. We were very mechanically inclined.
Okay. Where did he get his books and magazines?
Oh, they got them in the mail. They came through the mail, mostly. He didn't get them from outside the home, mostly.
Were your parents involved with politics at all when you were?
Oh, Dad was a staunch Republican, and so was his brother Chris, who served in the state Utilities Commission. He was a strong Republican.
What did his duties include, being the Utilities Commission?
Well, he was in charge of the trucking industry at that time in the state capital. Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about your parents?
I have to think a little bit on that one. They struggled through life real hard, and Dad was conservative, and I don't really know whether I should share this, but it was mom's intelligence. Dad bought a farm for each of the boys. I got to stay on the home place, but they spread them out real good. One of them was, my oldest brother was south of Bottle, which is about 40 miles from here, and the other brother was northeast of Ashley, and the other one north of Danzig, and the other one south of Loyola. Mom made sure they wouldn't get into each other's hair. And Mom was very, very intelligent about that. She knew how to control those things, that the family would stay together. And during those years, in the latter years, Mom would almost say, I hope you family get along together. And we did. After Mom and Dad passed away, we had a good relationship with the whole family. And my mom used to say, you children, you all got enough. There's nothing for you to complain about. My mother and dad worked hard to give us a good life. Yeah.
Speaking of your brothers, when and where were they born?
Well, the oldest, Rudy was the oldest. He was in 1916, and the next sister, I don't know, must have been in between, because my other brother Leo was in 1919. The other ones I can't hardly tell you which year they were born.
Okay. Have you ever heard any interesting stories about your brothers or sisters' births?
No. I could share this one with you, but it's a little bit on. When my sister Frida was born, the one that's in California now, Dad was gone thrashing, and Mom shared this with us sometimes. And then when she knew that the baby was coming, she went out and she quickly milked the cows, because Dad was gone thrashing at the time. Sister Frida was born in the latter part of August. And when by the time he came home, Frida was born already, and Mom had her laying on her chest, and then they called the doctor to cut the umbilical cord. Mom delivered her all herself. She just shared that in later years with us. Yeah. But the rest of them, all of us were born in the old house, except the younger sister. She was born in the new house then. But they were all born out on the farm.
Right. You mentioned that you and your brothers and sisters got along later in life. Did you always get along when you were kids?
Oh, sure. Well, the older ones were gone by the time the younger ones came along. Had married out already, yeah.
What type of mischief did any of you or your brothers and sisters get into?
Can't think of anything right off the top of my head. The interesting thing, getting back to church, when we had Christmas program, the end thing about we had to do a lot of memory work then, memorize verses, and when we used to go up on the platform, we had to bow, and then we recite our little piece that we had to say, and after we got off the platform, we had to bow again. That was part of the ritual in those years. Yeah.
Do you remember anything that you had to recite?
No, that was all in German. That was all in German, yeah.
Speaking of religion, let's talk a little bit more about that. You mentioned your dad was very religious. Was religion important during your childhood?
My dad or mine?
Your childhood.
Oh yeah, we were faithful in church attendance. That was a faithful thing. Sunday morning, that was cold sometimes, but we went to church, and then they first had to fire up the stove, and sometimes it was 10:30 or 11 till the church was warm enough for us to sit down and sit in the pews, and then my dad would conduct the services then. And quite a few of the neighbors would come, even though it was cold, and if at all possible, they used to have church services on Sunday morning, if at all possible. They had a party line that they could call each other, whether they were having services or not. But that was standard procedure. As much as possible, you had services.
What denomination were you raised as?
Well, in those years it was known as the Evangelical, and then later on the Evangelicals united with the United Brethren Church, and it was called the United Brethren Church. And then later on the United Brethren Church became a part of the Methodist Church then, and the national as a whole. Now we are called United Methodist Church here in town.
What were the seating arrangements like?
Men on the right, ladies on the left. And the mothers usually took care of the children. The fathers very seldom got involved with taking care of the children in church.
What were some of the other religious activities that you participated in?
In the early days here?
Yeah.
Well, we really... That's about the only thing that I can remember, that they had Christmas programs. Sometimes they had revival meetings where the pastor would come out for a week and conduct services in the evenings, revival meetings.
Who would all come for the revival meetings?
Oh, mostly the local people there around the area. You know, from the denomination, not too many outsiders would come for that.
And how long would the revivals last?
Well, that one was usually about a week, I think they had it. In town here, they had one at one time that lasted a lot longer. They had one, I think, that lasted about 5 weeks or 7 weeks. And my parents used to drive in here too sometime and in the evening and attend the revival meetings in town here.
Were you baptized or confirmed?
I was baptized as a youngster and went to confirmation school in Eureka here at that time.
Okay. During your confirmation, was it in German or English?
That was in English then.
That was in English. Did your family have a celebration after your confirmation?
No. That was not in those years.
Were you able to question religious teachings as a child?
No. I never questioned that.
Did your parents restrict anything because of religion?
Oh yeah. They didn't want us to go to movies. They didn't want us to play cards. That was a no-no. They never denied us not to go to the movies, but we knew in the conversation that we shouldn't go to the movies. But it just was kind of those movie people. They were, how should we say, they traded partners or whatever, and they didn't care much for that.
Okay. Was Sunday dinner or Sunday supper different than any other day of the week?
Well, Sunday dinner, they come home and Mom would make a meal, and then that was about it. Then the summer months, we boys, right after the war, there were a lot of neighbor boys together, so we had a softball team, and we played various other towns around the area. And all of those other areas, they had small softball teams. And so from about April or May till about the first part of July, those farm boys would get together and have a softball team at the neighbor's place there.
And you played softball on Sundays?
Yep. Yeah. My dad was a great softball. My dad was great in playing baseball. In his days, they had baseball teams. And of course, there was a farm every half a mile in those years. And there was a lot of groups together. Yeah.
Okay. What were the types of food that were served on Sunday dinners?
I can't recall any of that.
Okay.
Noodle soup mostly, I think, sometimes.
What language was used in your church services?
German. That was all in German. And we kids, by the time we went to local school, that was all. We spoke everything German at home. Yeah, everything was in German. And the Bible was read in German. Church service in German, the singing in German. That was all in German.
Do you remember any songs or prayers in German?
Oh yeah, I and Stella can sing German songs for you if you want to hear them.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
Do you want to do that now, or do you want to do that later?
We'll do that later.
Okay. During World War II, was there ever any problems with speaking German?
No, not for us.
How did your family respond and react towards death?
It was just a natural thing that happened. But the interesting thing about the funerals in those years, out in that country cemetery, I remember they would put the casket down into a wooden box, and then one or two fellas would go down and nail the cover on it. And then after that was done, then the rest of these were all local people that did that kind of work, and they would start throwing the dirt into the grave. And that was all dug by hand in those years too. Especially in the winter months, that was hard. I helped dig one of them in the winter months, and man, the ground was frozen. But that was hard work. Yeah.
How did your family view other faiths?
No problem.
You mentioned earlier that you had a Christmas program. I was wanting to ask
Oh,
you.
yeah, that's why I shared about the saying the Christmas tree. We young boys, we usually sat in the front row, and the Christmas tree was right in front of us. And they had little clips where they put the candles in. And they would light them up. And then my uncle, he would always, as soon as those candles would burn down, he would put his hand on the flames and just put them out and put new candles into them, light them up from the other candle. And that was real nice. And then once in a while, the flames from the candle would hit the pines of that pine tree, and that put such a nice aroma into the building. We boys always had to sit in front of the church in those years when we were youngsters. And my dad would sit right behind me. And if we boys would whisper too much, we'd get poked.
What else do you remember about Christmas at church or at home?
Well, in Christmas, we used to get bags, and that was something very precious, Christmas treats in church. And we'd kind of, each one had his own bag, and he'd preserve it to himself so he would get to eat all of it themselves. And at home, Mom and Dad never talked about Santa Claus. That was nothing that they shared with us. But they talked about the Christ. I shouldn't say Santa Claus, but Christ, birth.
What was in those bags at church?
Oh, sometimes that was a treat in those years. We got an orange or a candy bar or some peanuts. That was a real treat for us young fellas. Yeah.
If they never talked about Santa Claus, did you get presents then?
Oh yeah, they exchanged gifts with us. They gave us gifts. Mom always had a gift for almost everybody. Yeah.
What types of gifts did you receive?
I got a harmonica one year. That one I remember. Yeah.
What was your favorite holiday?
Well, I really don't know whether I had a Christmas was really nice most of the time. That was a nice holiday. And you know, in those years, they always had Christmas the following day. They had church on Christmas. They had what they called Christmas next day, and also in Easter. If Easter fell on a Sunday, you always had Monday. You didn't do any work on Monday either. And they had church service on Monday too, on Easter. That was part of the religious thing in those years.
Okay.
Good Friday, no work. No meat on Friday. Noodles and prawns was usually the dish on Friday, because Grandpa Joachim, he fasted all day on Friday.
Did you celebrate other days such as Maundy, Thursday?
Maundy, Thursday, well, I can't recall. But Ascension Day, and those years they had Ascension Day. You didn't work on Ascension Day either. That was another day that we had church on Ascension Day.
Okay. During Christmas, what type of food would you eat? Did you have a special Christmas dinner?
No, that was not that much.
Did your family celebrate the 4th of July?
Oh yes, we youngsters always got to go to the 4th of July. Parents stayed at home, but we went to Greenway, which was a little town, and had to run and race. We run in races, and that little town at Greenway treated us real well on the 4th of July. When we were youngsters yet. After that, we were older. Then we actually played the Greenway softball team when we were older then. We had quite a group of fellas down there in our area. They were good ball players.
Would it be some of the rural kids versus the town kids?
Well, those were all rural kids too. The town was too small. It was just all farmers from around that area.
Okay.
Then there was Ardis, which was about 12 miles west of our place, and then Venturia, which was in North Dakota, about 10 miles north of our place. They all had softball teams.
Okay. Besides the racing, what other activities were there in town for kids?
Well, not much going on. Just on Sunday nights, once we grew older, we would go to town in Eureka on Sunday night, and there were so many young people, and I don't know, just fellowshipped around town with each other.
Did your family celebrate birthdays?
No, not much. Not that I can recall. Maybe they made a remark about it once in a while, but it was no big birthday celebration.
Okay. Did your family celebrate any other holidays such as Halloween or New Year's?
No. Well, New Year's was a church day too. They went to church on New Year's Day. Yep. Yeah, church was quite prevalent in those years.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about your grade school experiences. What did you want to be when you were growing up?
Nothing in particular that I can think of when I was a youngster. Mechanical things, mostly.
Okay. Where did you go to school?
That was better known as Deadmole Number 3, which was only about a quarter mile from our farm. So we walked there. We walked most of the time. Winter months, cold as could be. But I remember one time, I don't know why that sticks in my mind, was kind of blizzarding from the north, cold wind, and my older brothers and sisters, they were hanging on to me, and I was a little youngster stomping through the snow going to get to school. There were usually about 25 more or less students in that schoolroom. I remember one family that lived about 2 miles west of the schoolhouse, and they had to walk. They walked to school, and it was cold sometimes. In those years, the girls didn't wear slacks or anything, and they were there if at all possible, even if it was cold. They were faithful. And of course, and then when I'll have to share a little bit about school days. We had a barn there. Some people, the neighbors southwest of our place, came to school with a team of horses and a sled, and then sometimes we could ride home with them because they go through our yard on their way home. But as far as games in the school, on the barn was usually you throw a ball over the head, Andy over, and how the thing works anymore. And then when there was new fallen snow, the first thing by the time you got to school, they had a big ring with the 4 crosses on it, and they called it Fox and Goose. And now how the game played anymore, I can't even tell you. But that one I can picture it. And then in recess, we played a lot of softball in school days and recess, a lot of it. That was practically all that was done. Then we had a good swing in school. and a teeter-totter later years. Those teachers had tough going. I tell you, some of those teachers, and they came to school in the morning, then they had to fire up the coal stove, and it was cold sometimes till we got going. But they were good teachers. They carried a heavy load. Yeah.
What was the composition like of the students? You mentioned there was 25 students. Were they mainly German from Russia, or were they a mix of ethnicities?
They were all people that, like my parents, that lived in the area there, within a certain area there.
Okay. How many boys and how many girls were there roughly? What was the ratio?
I can't. I wouldn't know.
Okay. You mentioned that most of the students were there even when it was cold. Did they ever have to miss school for work?
No, not in my day. Well, school let out about the first part of April, so we were mostly home. By the time field work started, we were home to help around the yard and field work. And I didn't do well. I remember school days. By the time I was 8th grade, and that wasn't too much to do.
What is your favorite memory about going to school?
I like geography and history. Well, my neighbor right next to me, he was all a mathematic person. We were good friends together all our lives. We lived together, we farmed together throughout all our lifetime, and had a good relationship together throughout all those years.
Okay, if those were your two favorite subjects, what was your least favorite subject?
Mathematics or arithmetic.
Did you have a lot of homework?
Not too much. Even in the evening we sit down a little bit, but not really too much homework. Mom would help us along the best she could, but most of the time we had to do that ourselves. But I don't recall having too much homework.
Okay. Were you a good student?
Fair. C average.
You mentioned geography and history and math. What other subjects were you taught?
That one. Social studies they had there, one subject, and that's about all I can recall.
Okay.
Reading, writing, arithmetic.
Did you read any books at home besides the ones you had to read for school?
No.
Did you ever get into any trouble at school?
Sometimes I got took out into the little room, the teacher spanked me.
What were some of the reasons?
I don't know what I goofed off. I don't recall that. I know I got a spanking from the teacher. And they had a little entry in the schoolroom there. She took me out and she spanked me.
Okay. You mentioned you spoke German at home. What languages were spoken at school?
All English. That was English speaking then. No German.
Did you ever get in trouble for speaking German?
No. I've heard of students that did, but not in our case.
Did you learn English at school?
Yes, that's where we learned it.
Was it a hard subject to learn?
No. Even now, considering for 8th grade education, I can read real fast. Could read real fast.
What did you take for lunch to school, and how did you take it?
An old syrup bucket, and usually a bread with syrup on it, and sometimes a pickle. Because I remember one time going up to the teacher and asking her a question, and then she turned her head and she said to me, "Did you have one of those pickles for lunch today?" And I said, "Yes." She could smell it on my breath that I had a pickle for lunch, and an apple sometimes. Well, it's mostly bread and syrup bread. and just the main stables. But usually a round bucket, which used to be an empty serve bucket, never a bottom dinner pail. And in those years they used a lot of syrup. Yeah.
Do you remember any of your teachers?
Not too much. One of them was a lady from Aberdeen one time by the name of Irma Dami. And then, of course, when they had the Christmas programs, that was a big thing in school. We had to memorize a lot of things. They put on a program in school, the teachers. So we had a kind of a platform out in front of the school. We lifted that into the front end of the school, and then we had sheets, bedroom sheets, white sheets. They strung a wire across and they pulled them across there, and we had to hide in behind those. And then we had to play was going on. That all was presented on the platform in that little in the schoolroom, and the people would crowd into that thing all full to the around the standing room only.
Do you remember any of the plays that you were in?
Oh, one of them I really remember, like Wilma Haupt. You're just talking about Wilma Haupt. Her husband's brother. He was out of school already, and they drafted him into. Then they had a play, wedding ceremony. He was the bride and I was the groom. I was a little short fella, and Wilma's husband was the preacher. And so he started out, "My children, I," and then he was on the wrong page, and he'd page around. And that's about all I remember of that incident. It was a real humorous one. Yeah, Manuel was out of school then too already, or maybe not. Maybe he wasn't in school yet. Wilma's husband.
Besides the little plays you put on, did your school celebrate any holidays such as Halloween or Valentine's Day?
Oh yeah, we got a little. I had to draw out some Valentines, cut out some Valentines, and make them. Usually on Friday afternoon, the last class on Friday afternoon was usually no study period, what they call penmanship and all other activities. That was always something the kids looked forward to, that last session in the afternoon, Friday afternoon. Draw things and different varieties of things. That was the highlights of the school year, last Friday, every Friday.
Were you encouraged or discouraged from going to high school?
It so happened that I couldn't go. I graduated, and then both of my brothers were called into service. My dad wanted me to go, but I wasn't made for books. But then my brothers went into service, and then Dad needed me at home to help with the farming operation. And by the time they were in long enough, then I got drafted when I was 19 and a half. I went out with the last group out of McPherson County till World War II. After that, they didn't draft anymore.
Okay.
There were 41 in the last group that went out on the. At that time, we went out by rail through a Milwaukee Railroad, came through here, and there was about 41, like I said, that were shipped out that day. I was drafted in May, and my brother started coming home. See, the war ended the first part of May, and then I was drafted in the latter part of May. And my brothers came home in the fall of the year, that year then. In Germany, I'm talking about Germany.
Let's switch over to your life on the farm for a couple questions.
Oh, okay.
Can you describe the homestead or farmstead you grew up on?
Oh, yeah, that was. Well, the thing that I remember when they used to plant potatoes, they would plow a furrow, and then you would step it off and put a potato in every so far. Every step you put in a potato. Then they would come, and Dad would come along with a hand plow and plow them shut again. They made them wide enough, plow them wide enough so they could cultivate with the corn cultivator through the rows. And so in the fall of the year, when the potatoes had matured, Dad would come along with a hand plow and plow them out, and we had to gather them up and put them into the wagon box and haul them down into the basement of the house. I don't remember the old house that potatoes putting in there, but I remember putting potatoes into the new house. There was a pile that was about this high and just sloped down like that. They raised a lot of potatoes in those years for stable food during the winter months.
What other crops were grown besides potatoes?
They had wheat and barley and oats. That was all part of it. They bindered and headered. There's a header out there. If you, I'll maybe Edmund up will explain it to you how a header works. And they also got a grain binder out there. We had to shock it and header it and headering. I don't know. Do you know anything about headering?
I don't. If you'd like to explain.
Oh yeah. Once you get out there, once you see it, you'll see it how it's done. It's loose. It's bundles. Bindering is it's tied up in bundles, and you had to shock them up, and then pick them up and haul them through the thresher. And the headering, they would put it up on the box, and then that's all loose stuff. Put it on a stack, and they were lined up stack after stack, and they pulled the thrashing machine, the feeder, into that, and you forked it onto the thrashing machine. That's all out there in the museum. You'll see it.
Okay. Did you ever experience isolation out on your farm?
Not really. The only thing I remember that even though after the war we had, it was 49 or 50, we had so much snow. And I remember putting the car in the shed the 1st of January and didn't take it out until February 15th. And that winter I and my dad drove to town with the horses, with the sled, bobsled. And by the time, it was a nice day that time, and those horses had to stomp through in behind the hills. Sometimes they just, snow almost up to their bellies, they'd stomp through there. There was so much snow that year. And of course we made it real good. Rough it too. But that was in later years then.
How did your family gain possession of their land?
My dad, Grandpa, my mother's dad, bought the farm that we were on. First of all, when they came back from White River, they lived with Grandpa during the winter that first year. And then in the spring of the year, Grandpa bought the farm about 2 miles from Grandpa's place, and that's where they were put on then. That's how they started. Then later on, they bought another quarter land out west, another quarter land on the south side, and then another quarter up north. But the original place was just a quarter there, quarter and an 80, which was somebody else had lived down there and kind of moved away, and then Grandpa Yoakum bought it for their mom and dad.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that there was hogs and cows. What other animals did you have on your farm?
They had sheep on there, and chickens, and geese. That was all part. Every family had milk cows. You milk cows every day, morning and evening. That was standard procedure for every family. And Dad had sheep yet, and chickens and geese. Everything.
Whose job was it to milk the cows?
Everybody in the family. Mom and Dad and the family all. The greatest joy was milking the cows. Is when the cat was sitting there, you could take the cow's tit and you squirt the milk down there to the cat, and they would lick it up just like that. And you had a little stool you sat on, and a pail in between you, and milked. And grew up on unpasteurized milk. Made it. And then, of course, they separated the milk, and the skim milk was taken to the hogs, and the cream was taken to the house, and every so often the cream was hauled to town. That was money for groceries to buy that day. Yeah. They built it out of old lumber from Grandpa Yoakum's place, right next to the windmill. Half of the shed was kind of a auxiliary shed. In the summer months, the separator was down in that building, and the south side was more or less a feed shed for the hog feed in there. And we had to ground the barley, put it into a barrel, put water on it in the night, and the next day that barley was soaked up real good. Then we had to carry it out to the hogs the next day. They got about 10 gallons of soaked up barley that we carry out to the hogs. They had always felt it and soak up that grain so it produces better on the hogs. And we had to carry water to the hogs, which was maybe about 100 or 150 feet away. That was quite a chore to carry the water to the hogs all the time. And of course, with the hogs, you carry the feed down there. Sometimes they'd grab a hold of you and push you over, and we didn't care much for that. So sometimes when they were away a little bit, we'd quickly sneak in there and pour the barley in there, and out the door we'd go, out the gate we'd go. Yeah, they were ornery sometimes. And the other thing about hogs, usually in the fall of the year, they would husk the corn, put it in the corn crib, and they would give them the whole cob. And those cobs that were left over, they were used in the kitchen in that cook stove. They were a real source of heat, real fast. And of course they wouldn't last very much, but then they would heat real fast, and then they could pull the wood on top of that.
Okay. Could you describe some of the buildings that were on your farm?
When Mom and Dad got it, there was an old barn, not a hip roof barn, straight roof barn. I told you about the hay that we put up in there. That was there with the shed on the north side and the shed on the south. South side was used for calves. The north side was kind of a utility building. The one shed they had on the north side of the barn, they told me that was before my day. They had the Model T car in there one time. And then those were the only original. The house and the barn were only original, and the one by the windmill. Wait a minute, there's another loafing barn, which used to be the granary. Later on, we took that away from the granary and made it a cattle loafing barn. And that was an old, but that granary was strictly sitting on rocks, no foundation or anything, just rocks that was placed on. Even the house out there is all sitting on rocks, not no cement foundation. But later on, they had put a form around it and poured cement around it so it would seal around the outside, because the cellar was down under it. And my brother just told me not too long ago that the potatoes didn't freeze down underneath there. It was seemed like it was kind of open, but it didn't freeze down there. So it was really a nice area there. And you could go down from the outside, you could go down at that cellar in the old house, and also that door on the inside, you could get in down in there. Yeah, Dad was quite ingenuous about putting that little one-cylinder motor down the cellar and driving the washing machine.
Okay. And where did you get your water for the farm?
Down from that well. Carried it all up, which was maybe about 200, 300 feet away, and real hard water. That was awful hard water. And then they had a cistern beside the house. They had dug a cistern beside the house, which was kind of soft water, rainwater that came off of the roof. And that was used for washing a lot, and taking a bath and things like that.
Could you describe how the well was dug?
Down the well, no, I can't tell you. They were done by horses. They had horses walking around, and then with a bucket would dig it out and pull it out again. That was all done with horsepower, from what I understand.
Okay.
Horses would walk around and around.
Could you describe the roads to your farm?
Well, that was mostly a country road, just a trail. And so was the section line across about a quarter mile east of our place, which was filled up later on, graded up, and so it's a gravel road, fairly good gravel road now.
Okay. You mentioned one of your neighbor friends earlier. Do you remember any of your other neighbors?
Oh yeah, there was like Wilma Haupt's husband. His brother was in the same class as I was, and some of the other relatives that were southeast of our place. I know I and my neighbor went together one night during the winter months when I hooked up a horse on a little platform, and we went down there to visit my other two cousins that lived about 3 miles away in the evening. Then we came home again and unsaddled, unharnessed it, and I don't know how we did it. I don't remember how we, but in those years, when you milked in the morning when it was dark, we had a little lantern, kerosene lantern, that was hung in the middle so you could get around to see. Yeah. Oh yeah, the thing I remember when I went with a horse, I mostly went with a flashlight and unharnessed the horse and put it in the barn again. Of course, the horses were always in the barn in those years.
Okay. How close did your neighbors live to your farm?
Oh, the one right north of me, which my friend for all the years, they're about a quarter mile away, a little better. And then another one about a half a mile away. And then a little bit southeast, a little better than a half a mile away. They all came to the same school.
Okay. Was neighboring a common practice when you were growing up?
Not too much. They would come over sometimes. We sometimes would go to the neighbors southwest of the place, get on the horse and ride down there to them, and they would come up during the winter months, and we'd fellowship together. There were two boys down there, and my brother, older brother Milton, and myself, we'd take the horseback and ride down there, and they would come up to our place sometimes. No saddles. Everything was bareback those years. We never even owned a saddle. Neither did the neighbors.
Okay. What types of things did you do with your neighbor friend?
Oh, we just visited most of the time. Yeah.
Okay. What were some of the positive aspects of growing up on a farm?
Well, did a lot of worked with the horses for many years. And then when we quit the horses, then Dad had a 1020 McCormick Daring tractor with the steel wheels. I got to operate that even in the younger years yet. And then in those years, when the plow hit a rock, it would unhook. And then I had to back up and jump back down again and rehook that plow and then start driving with that. And that thing would unhook maybe about, varied from place to place, but at least 2 times for each round when you went down through about a quarter-mile field, depending upon whether a field had a lot of rock or not. That tractor was a good tractor, that 1020 tractor. That's the one Dad used, put it on a burr mill to ground up the barley to. And we back up in there with a load of barley and put it to the grinder and then shovel it on a pile there and pile it into the barrel to soak up for the hogs.
Okay. Were there any negative aspects about growing up on a farm?
No, I enjoyed it.
Okay.
And then later years, you got better tractors and better equipment as far as that's concerned. And even when I started farming after the war years, then things started improving so fast that technology different.
Okay.
Even Dad had his first thrashing machine bought I think in 1924, and 28 he bought it at his own. He bought it together with his brothers and brother-in-laws. Then later in 28 he got it himself. And then after the war years, then when everybody was almost ready to go into combining, my dad even bought a thrashing machine. He just about couldn't see that we couldn't thrash anymore. So he bought a thrashing machine on rubber. And we used that maybe about a few years, and then everything went to combines.
Okay.
Yeah, different transition.
All right, William. Would you like to tell us about the clock that used to sit on your mantle?
The clock was sitting on a little shelf down in the basement. Well, first of all, when they built the new house in 1933, the clock was on a little shelf on the north side of the wall. And may I backtrack a little bit? When they built the house back in 1933, the practice in those years was they lived down in the basement. Why, I don't know. But we lived in there from 1933 or 34 when they moved into the house until 1947 or 48 when they got REA electricity. Then we moved upstairs. We had all our meals and dinners upstairs. But before that, all our dinners and everything were conducted downstairs. And then the clock with the swinging pendulum, I don't know where Mom and Dad got that from, but I think my older brother said they got it from an auction sale at one time. And it was sitting on a little shelf about this wide. And the interesting thing about it was that on either side of that clock, on the left side was the family Bible, which was in German, and on the right side was a clothes brush about this size. And every morning, Dad would take that German Bible off, and he'd read a portion of it. And then they would kneel down, and then first Dad would pray, and then Mom would pray to the Lord. And we children all had to kneel down behind the table or the little bench that we had, and when they had their devotions then in the morning. In later years, they sang a little song hymn at the end when they were done with their morning devotions. And after that, then we went out on our daily work and doing the farm work that needed to be done.
Do you remember the little hymn that they sang?
Oh yeah. Well, in later years they sang that. So nimm den meine Hände, which most German people at that time knew by memory. Okay. So take my hand, dear Lord.
Okay. And what is the story behind the basket that you have?
Well, the basket, I don't have much knowledge on that, but I know it from what I understand that my Grandpa Merkel made it out of rye straw, should I say. I'm sorry. Made out of rye straw. How he made it, I don't know. Did he have some kind of a tool to make it? It's a real tight fit knit. And Mom and Dad Mom used to have her sewing equipment in there for many years, and then after Mom and Dad departed, and then we got that, I and my wife got that part of the family to keep and have and hold. Where it goes on from here, I don't know.
Okay. Was it common for people to make baskets like that for themselves?
I don't know. That was before my days. Grandpa Merkel, I barely got to know my Grandpa Merkel. I think if I remember seeing him once, that's about once or twice before he passed away, and also Grandma Merkel, the same thing.
And what's the story behind the bell that we saw?
Oh, the bell. The bell that was in our country school. And first of all, it was in the top of the schoolhouse in a little tower. And then for some reason, I don't know why, they moved it out of the little tower, and they could ring the bell from the rope on the inside of the schoolhouse, on the little entry. And then later on, they took it off of that little bell tower, and they set it on a post. And when the school dissolved, then it was sold at auction, and then I bought it for $17. And then, of course, on the day of our farm auction sale, it was advertised early in the morning at 11:30. They're going to sell the bell. And there was a lady from Bismarck that was collecting bells. And for some reason or other, some fellow that grew up in my area here made her aware that there was a school bell on that auction listing. And she was down there, and she bid him up, and they kept going till they got $1,000 for that bell. They paid me $1,000 for that bell then. But my neighbor he didn't want to let that go, but I think on the next bidding, I think he'd have backed out, but she backed out first. But that was a surprise that day.
And did you ever use the bell on your farm?
Oh yes, I had that for at least about 20 or 30 years. And when my mother used to live with me, she would ring the bell when my cow lot was about 200 or 300 yards away from the house, and she would ring the bell, and I could come. In later years, when Stella came along, she needed help when I was around the yard. She would just ring the bell, and it was easy to hear a long distance. And we didn't want to bring it into town, because if we'd have put it up here in town, I think we'd have had all the neighbors for lunch.
All right. Could you tell us a little bit about the cemetery that we visited?
Oh, that cemetery that we visited was a part of the original piece of ground that Grandpa Yoakum got from the U.S. government at the time. And then later on, after Grandpa kind of established a church there, which was about a mile east of the cemetery, and then the cemetery was made there. How should I explain it? My grandpa is buried there, and a lot of other neighbors that are buried there, and my parents are buried there, and various ones that I have 3 cousins from my uncle's family are buried there. All 3 children passed away in their younger years, and they're all 3 of them are side by side. And then, of course, I have an aunt buried there too, my mother's sister. And so a lot of them, the people, they hardly know who they are, except they looked it up in the record in the courthouse, and they put it on that poster that we have there, or what do you call it? Reminder where all the people that are buried on that cemetery.
Okay. Let's switch over to your environment a little bit and growing up on the plains. What was it like for you growing up on the plains?
Oh, that was a great time. At that time, we youngsters, we used to go out and catch gophers. And we'd cut off the gopher tail and take it to the county, and we got a few cents per gopher tail, sometimes 3 cents, sometimes 5 cents. I got that in years later is what the county paid for them. In my day, I think it was 1 or 2 years where we got paid for the gopher tails. We trap them and then take the tail and take it over to the county, and they paid us for them. But the interesting thing about, and this is one of the most surprising environmentalist things that I cannot figure out to this day. That's about 10 years ago. We had gophers, those flicker-tailed gophers. They're kind of a yellowish, brownish color. They were around here by the thousands. And when you drive to town, there was every so often you would have one running across the road. And then in 1 year, they were all gone. Never saw one after that, not since then. There are some of them are still out here in the park. Why they survived, I don't know, but there are some of them out here in the park of the flickertails. But they tell me now that there are some, it's a smaller kind of a gopher. It's a striped one, darker color, but those are still out there. But very few that you see. And the same thing was with rabbits. At one time, one winter, we had so many rabbits. There are people here in town that went to 2 farms west of town here on a rabbit hunt. They went through the shelter bells. One Sunday afternoon they got 250. The next Sunday afternoon they got 300 on one afternoon. And then there were a lot of even out in my farm there, I had a lot of them. I went out and shot them, and sometimes in the evening, every time you go out in the evening, check the cows, there were rabbits before sunset. The rabbits would be caught. They usually come running in around sunset. But then all of a sudden, they disappeared. You hardly see any of them. But today, they tell me you see one every so often driving along the road. How nature works, I don't think anybody knows how that works.
Okay. What else did you hunt besides gophers and rabbits as a child?
Well, I wasn't much of a pheasant hunter, even though this is great pheasant hunting country. But I never hunted much in pheasants.
Okay. What did you find beautiful or enjoyable about growing up on the plains?
Oh, just sit out there, even in latter years now. There is something about sitting out there on the front porch. You know how our front porch was there looking toward the east. You can sit on there and just gaze at the horizon, and it just never becomes old. It's just something you enjoy to see it in everyday life. And it's just wonderful to watch the world as it goes by, should I say. Okay. Yeah.
Is there anything that you find bleak or unpleasant about growing up on the plains?
No, never. I always enjoyed it, especially when I was working out in the field, plowing and seeding. Later years, you plowed and seeded at the same time. First of all, we had those open tractors with no cabs on them, and like the winds, they were strong and cold. I remember one year, I had an open tractor. That was in the 70s sometime, and it was so cold, dressed with high overshoes and coveralls and hoods and everything. And finally, a neighbor right across the fence was working there too. Finally, I said, I don't have to put up with that. And at 4 o'clock, I went home. I said, that's enough of that. It was cold and windy. So I went home. Then latter years when I had a cab, I enjoyed it a little bit more. Even though I had a radio in that cab, I very seldom played the radio, because I just enjoyed watching CNN. I had the greatest joy of, should I say, I was in the Lord's work and I enjoyed it, being a servant of His and being His steward, and taking care of His soil, and what He had given to me to take care of.
Okay. Could you describe what a typical winter was like while you were growing up?
That varied from year to year. Some winters were open and some winters were very lot of snow. I think I shared one winter. I and my dad drove to town with the bobsled, because I think that was the winter when we put the car in the shed at January 1st, and we didn't take it out until February 15th. Then we could drive that again. Up until that time, we did it all by horses. I and my dad drove to town with a sled and home again, and it was a nice day. And a nice day in the morning. By the time in the evening, the wind already had picked up a little bit. But I and my dad had a good time driving to town that day. But even at that, when you came in behind the hill with the slope on it, those horses just had to stomp through it. They're just about as deep as the snow was up to their bellies. But we had a good trip that day.
How about fall? What was a typical fall like for you?
Typical fall was thrashing time. That started about the latter part of August or first part of September. And that usually went on for about two months. Some years more, mostly October. One year I remember, I and my sister, when my two older brothers were gone in service, then I and my sister, we were finished thrashing October 28th in a field about 2 miles north of the farm. And we were still whooping and hollering on the way home that we finished up October 28th. And we were glad we had finished that field, that thrashing by then. And then after we were done with the thrashing, well, we thrashed for several farmers, for my Uncle Fred and Merkel, which is about 5 miles northwest, and then for our neighbor across the road, Art Fifley. We thrashed for him, and they helped us and we helped them. And so some years we got rained out maybe for about a week or so. You had to wait till you could get going again. And then, of course, then the fall after that, then we started hauling hay from the Venturia Lake, which is 7 miles away. So that took about 2 weeks, got that all hauled home. By the end of November, it was getting pretty close to winter time.
What would you do for the 1 week where you had a rain delay?
Oh, that was odds and ends. They'd always find those fathers and those farms, those years, they always found a way to do something for the boys.
Okay. What was a typical summer like for you?
Well, in those years, that was before we had alfalfa. And of course, we also had a rural telephone, which from Eureka to our farm. And that telephone line had 25 members on its telephone line. And so if it rang at one farm, it rang through the whole party line. And I don't remember what our ring was, too long and too short, or usually 5 digits. Too long, 3 short, and too long. That certain farmer knew that was his call. And usually there for a time we used to work on that for 2 weeks. For 1 year that I remember, or 2 years, we had to work on that to get everything ready. Being when REA came in, then we had to string another wire on that rural telephone system, because there was too much static on it. We had to twist those wires every half a mile in order to break the static of the REA lines. But we were fortunate. We had a good telephone line. We had good telephone poles in it. And later on, we sold it to Northwestern Bell in September of that year. And that year, in December, we got a fog or sleet and tore out that whole telephone line. And boy, were we glad we didn't have to repair that thing that year, because we could have never called together to call the neighbors together to work. And Bell Telephone fixed it from that time on.
Did other people ever listen in on your phone calls?
Oh, sure. But they knew they were not supposed to. But sometimes you would listen. And if you knew there was an emergency or something, we very seldom listened in. But one time, later on, when Bell Telephone took over, when there were only 6 people on the line, it happened so one night that one of our high school kids was here in town, and we got a blizzard, and he got caught in the blizzard and wasn't home by the next night. That was north of our place yet. And so the county crew went out that night on a blader, and those years the CB was something that was real new. And our neighbor had a CB, and they were listening in on the county and going north to try and locate that fellow out on the road to see if they could find him. But that night I told Stella we're going to listen in. And sure enough, that was one of those very fortunate things. The fellow was in his vehicle from the night of after the basketball game till to the next night at 10 or 11 o'clock, to when the county found him then. And it was still in a blizzard. That was a very bad blizzard that night yet when that county went out that night. They barely could go with the snow plow on it, but they found him alive. And all he did was freeze part of his heel on the back end of his foot. And Lowell Doan, he lived in Texas then, and about 2 years ago he passed away.
Could you please describe a typical spring for you?
Well, we got up in the morning, and then we had to go out and do the chores and milk the cows, and then sometimes after the cows were milked, some of the fellows went and did the separating, and the others started harnessing up the horses, getting them in. And so by 7:30 we usually were done with breakfast and milking, and then took out the horses and got them all hooked up together. Most of the time what I worked with horses was mostly with plow, 2-bottom plow. And of course, when you ride a plow like that, when there are a lot of rocks, you get bounced off and this way and that way. And Dad had a plow that was a 212. Most of the plows were 214s, and this one was a 212. It was a lighter plow. And when that thing hit a rock, it would bounce you all over the area. And so after plowing, then I did a lot of cultivating with the corn on it. And later in the summer, he cultivated corn with a single row cultivator. And then in the fall, then later in the summer, like I said, haying time. Then haying time started, and then it became then the harvest started, where you start bindering and headering. That was about the cycle of the summer. And I would plow, and Dad would seed. Well, it took quite a few days to plow about 24 inches wide, where the grain drill was 10 foot wide. And so we seeded that. And later years, like I said, with the tractor, two-bottom plow behind that steel wheel tractor, and the plow would always unhook. And then I would have to go down and back up to the right place and get off the tractor and rehook it up again and take off again. And that happened sometimes 2 or 3 times per round through a quarter-mile field.
Okay. Did you have a favorite horse?
Not really. There was one black and one buckskin that I used to ride all the time. Dad had we had a quarter of land about 2 miles north of our place. Now, in the earlier years, they always had the horses in the barn. Then in the latter years, they didn't put them in the barn anymore. They just let them out and feed the straw stacks. And so I had to take that buckskin horse and ride 2 miles north in the winter months. And we had a well back there. I had to pump water for him and then come home again. But the craziest thing about that horse, I couldn't get up on it because it's a regular work horse. And so I had to lead him up beside the fence and crawl up on the fence and jump on him. And sometimes he didn't cooperate. He'd move away again, and then I'd have to bring him back again. Finally, I got on him and went home again. I was maybe about 13 years of age then. Cold, or put a scarf over my face, and then right bareback up there. That wasn't bad. It was enjoyable. The horse kept you warm on your butt.
All right. Out of all those seasons, which one was your favorite?
Oh, I really wouldn't. Well, spring is usually a nice time to be. That's usually nice when the birds start coming, when the meadowlarks start coming back, and the frogs are in the pond and they have their evening noises when they sing their songs. That is really something to enjoy. Spring was really nice. Spring work was a nice way to enjoy.
You mentioned the boy who got stuck in the blizzard. How close was the nearest doctor when you were growing up?
Oh, the nearest doctor was in my town about 10 miles away.
Okay. Was anyone in your family seriously ill or injured when you were young?
Not that I can recall. Not that I know. No, not in our immediate family.
Okay. Do you remember any home remedies or cures that your parents had for you?
Not that I know of. That my mom, we used to buy Watkins liniment that was used in those years. Some of it had smelled up the whole household, but we didn't use that too much. I don't know, for some reason or other, we just didn't have too many colds or aches and pains in our days. We were fortunate; we were spared a lot of that.
Okay.
Or accidents, farm accidents. The only one that I remember was my younger brother one time. He was a little younger, and Mom had the washing machine going, and he was going to hold something, got his hand caught in the roller. In those years, they had those rollers that squeezed the water out of the material, and he got his arm caught in there up to past the elbow. But Mom noticed it right away, so she pushed the emergency button, and that thing opened up then. That was about the only one that I can remember. He was never injured on that one.
Okay. All right. You mentioned earlier that your two brothers were in the war and that you were in the war late. What do you remember about World War II?
Well, I was not. I was with the war was in Germany was over with by the time I got drafted. And then I took my basic in Texas. They sent me out to the West Coast, and from the West Coast they sent me over to the East Coast, and to be with the occupation troops in Europe. So by the time I got over there in December, first part of December, and the war had ended in May. So it was, all I saw was mostly the rubble that took place throughout the war. I was never in combat.
Okay. Before you left to go over to the war, did rationing affect your family?
Did what?
Rationing?
Oh yeah, I remember rationing. So much sugar, so much flour, but it didn't affect our family too much because most of the products were from the cows and the chickens and the hogs. Kind of survived on that. And as far as getting fuel for the tractors, the farmers had a priority on that one anyway, to get fuel for the tractors. So we fared, we didn't get hurt too bad from the rationing end.
Okay. Where were you when Pearl Harbor was attacked?
I was home that day. I remember that one. We were up. You remember our basements downstairs? I came downstairs and Uncle Fred Merkels were there, and they said that we have just been attacked at Pearl Harbor. But what did I know about Pearl Harbor at that time? I was maybe about 14. Yeah, I think I was 14 years of age at that time, 14, 15. But that's the only, I remember that afternoon, it was around 3 or 4 o'clock when that message came on the radio that we were attacked.
Okay. Let's switch over to another historical event. You've talked a little bit about the dust storm that hit your house. What else do you remember about the Dirty 30s?
Well, as we were driving there yesterday, I told you about that field on the side of the road where we had cornfield, where we had a stake there, and we pulled the corn out of the ground, the little root system that it had, and then we fed it to the cattle. But my older brother said that the cattle didn't even want to eat that stuff, corn. That's how, it was only about a foot and 16 inches high, that corn. That I remember a little bit. And I can still know the field where it was. Yeah, that was not, it was dry, according to my mother said. It was dry. Okay.
Okay. What was your most stressful childhood experience?
I really don't remember any stressful days that I can recall. After my brothers were gone in service, and then I and my sister which is right above me. We had to do a lot of the farm work. She was good at farm work too. She did a lot of work, hauling bundles, headering, and hauling corn stalks home, shucking the corn stalks. And in the winter months, she didn't do too much. I and my dad did most of that. But she did a lot of work during the military years. And she was good at it.
Okay. What is your happiest childhood memory?
Oh boy. I really can't pinpoint any what really was a happy point right now.
Okay. What was the most adventurous thing you did during your childhood?
Boy, I can't tell you. I'll give you a humorous one.
Okay.
In the Model T Fords, they had what they call a Model T coil. And so I rigged it up one time that put it in the car, and I hooked it up to the car. And then what you had to do is I made it so as you pull a string, you drop a chain down there so you had a ground on the car. The tires in those years were made of rye and felt, so they didn't ground the vehicle. And so when I dropped that cable down and I started that buzzer, so one night I was in a town, and I made my bumpers fit to the car in front of us, and I touched that car, and the ladies came out and they touched the car. I got a shock. That was my mischievous time.
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to add about your childhood memories, or any stories you'd like to tell?
Not really too much that I can think of. Oh, I went to school when we drove by that lake yesterday. That lake was only maybe about 6 or 8 inches deep, and it was interesting how we kids used to do it. The ice wasn't froze hard enough, but it was just flexible enough. And then we as a group would line up, and just a wave in front of that ice would just be a bend wave, and we'd walk back and forth. Nobody broke down, but it was just hard enough so it wave, and I enjoyed that. I remember that one. That lake was right beside the school there. And that's about the extent of what I remember about my growing up years down there. I enjoyed it.
Okay.
Rock picking rocks. That was a lot of work. Picked a lot of rocks.
And where would you pick those rocks from?
They came out of the ground. Then we put them on the pile. And those years we had to put them on the wagon and then unload them on the wagon to a rock pile. Yeah.
Okay. Why do you think it's important to tell your life story?
Well, so that those that come years later might recognize that in the era that we were in, we did a lot of more physical work than people do now. And to understand that, like even my grandpas and my dad, they worked a lot harder physically than even I did when we had thrashing machines and plows and better things to handle things. And they worked a lot harder than I did. But I appreciated their work and appreciate that what we did so they would have a better life, an enjoyable life.
Okay. Are there any other thoughts or observations you'd like to share?
I can't think of any right off the bat. I think that I can remember.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you for spending these 2 days with us. It's been a pleasure, so thank you very much.
Thank you for coming, and I hope somebody gets a good, how should I say it? Remember the years gone by, how we were and how it is today. And they can enjoy the blessings that we worked, even though we enjoyed it. But they're receiving the blessings of our labors. Thank you. This song was sung a lot by the German people when they had revival meetings. It's got a good rhythm to it. those people, when they sang songs that had real rhythm to it, and that joy of the Lord came forth when they were singing. So right now we're going to sing Was kann es Schöneres geben? 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 Und was kann seliger sein? Als wenn wir unser Leben, als wenn wir unser Leben, als wenn wir unser Leben dem Herrn im Glauben weihen. Ich liebe meinen Heiland, ich liebe meinen Heiland, ich liebe meinen Heiland. Sein Name ist mir so süß, sein Name ist mir so süß, sein Name ist mir so süß. Gott ist die Liebe. That was usually sung many times, and still even today. We even have a pastor in church right now. He even learned the song, Gott ist die Liebe. Gott ist die Liebe, lass mich erlesen. Gott ist die Liebe, liebt auch mich. Drum sag ich's noch einmal, Gott ist die Liebe, Gott ist die Liebe, liebt auch mich. Sandte Jesu, den treuen Heiland, sandte Jesus und macht mich los. Drum sag ich's noch einmal, Gott ist die Liebe, Gott ist die Liebe, liebt auch mich. After morning devotions, my parents usually used to sing the song, So nimmt in meine Hände. And even sometimes in the last few years here, when we had funerals here in town, some of the older person had just passed away, and they wanted that song as the last song. So nimmt in meine Hände. So nimmt in meine Hände und führe mich bis an mein seliges Ende und ewiglich. Ich kann allein nicht gehen, nicht einen Schritt, wo du wirst gehen und stehen, dann nimm mich mit. I hardly can take one step without you, Lord, being with me, is one of the words to that song.